Greetings, Ohio Valley. This is Dan Lima with OSU Extension from Belmont County.
And this is Karen Cox from WVU Extension in Ohio County. Thanks for tuning in to Extension Calling, your source for research-based information for the farm, garden, and home.
Hello, Karen.
Hey, Dan. It is a new year, and we are back again.
It is 2023, and we had the same problem we had at the end of 2022, cold weather and ice.
Well, for some of our listening area, yes, indeed, there's been some incredible amounts of, maybe not incredible amounts. Well, maybe if this gets up to Buffalo, maybe. If you're in Buffalo, give us a call and let us know you're listening.
Yeah, this one might be the best show for you right now. Well, and the thing is, it might not be right now, but it might be next week. And if it's not next week, it'll probably definitely be the week after. So snow and ice are just a part of winter. At least
right.
Where we are.
Whenever we have snow and ice on our walking services and our driving services, we don't like it there, right? So we shovel it and we put down de-icing chemicals to make our traveling surfaces safer. But there's a lot to consider beyond just putting some salt out on your sidewalks. We're just going to talk about sidewalks because roads is a whole nother world. And there's a whole lot that goes into the application of chemicals on roadways to prevent icing. And that is a little bit above where we're going to talk.
Yeah. And the word salt is very generic.
Oh, it totally is.
So let's go into maybe not the formal definition of salt, but a salt's just an ion and a cation together.
Right.
So it's just two ions together, and they typically will go into solution and separate and do things. That's a salt. It's typically it's a very stable bond, and it's typically water soluble. We see it in fertilizers. We see it in cooking ingredients. We see it in what else we see it in? Pesticides.
Well, the thing is that there's a lot of things that are salts beyond sodium chloride, which is table salt. And I think that that's really where we want to go with this because we also have potassium chloride, magnesium chloride, calcium chloride, and even urea is a salt.
Yeah. And like I was saying, even pesticides come in the form of salts. That's how we handle them. It makes it easy to handle. And because it's soluble, it does have an application process as well, depending on what you're doing. So very useful, complicated, and we typically use the word salt to mean table salt because I think out of all the salts, that's probably the one that is most used and most common in households. But I guarantee it's not the only salt that you have in your household.
Oh, yeah. But what we want to talk about is what you put outside, right? So what are you going to use? Because sodium chloride can be pretty rough on your plants, right? It's super cheap. It's going to be your least expensive de-icing product, but it can do some serious damage to the plants, your lawn, your shrubs, trees, flowers, especially if you have plants that are not tolerant to salts. So things like your white pine, your arborvitae, those are all super sensitive to salt. And so you want to make sure if you have those super sensitive plants, then you want to use something that's less harmful. So less of the sodium chloride and maybe some of the other options that are out there.
So here's a thought. Salt is never going to be good for your plants with sodium chloride. Sodium chloride is not a good thing you put in your plants, but you have different tolerance levels depending on the plant that you have. Like, I want to say that palms are very salt tolerant, but there are things that are extra sensitive. So when sodium chloride goes into the soil, it actually binds the water stronger than the plant can pull it. In essence, it can actually pull the water out of the plant as well. So depending on the physiology of that tree or shrub or herbaceous plant, it could tolerate a certain threshold, but it's never you're going to get to a point where you're going to kill any plant with salt. There's a passive process that plants will actually uptake water through an open system from the soil to the leaves, and it's a series of tubes. So there's going to be a chemical attractant with the different solutes in the plant. There is the evaporation process of the water leaving the leaves, causing like a siphoning effect. But that salt could be a really strong pull downwards. So at one point, it will stop that flow of water in. But if strong enough, it can actually pull it out and start drying the plant. You'll see the plant completely drying if you did too much salt.
Right. It looks like it's wilting, that it needs water, but there's plenty of water in the soil. Sort of like when you have a lot of mineral buildup in your houseplants and they look like they're dry because they can't absorb that water anymore because the mineral concentration is too high out in the soil around them.
Yeah.
But also, the salts don't just affect the roots and the ability of the plant to absorb liquid. They can also affect the chlorophyll. So when they absorb the chloride ions from the different salts around, they accumulate in the leaves and they can actually interfere with chlorophyll production and photosynthesis. And so that is another harmful effect. And you can drive down the highways and you'll see trees in the medians that are really, they have what are called witch's brooms on the ends of their stems. Sweet gum is a really common problem with sweet gum, in that the tips will die back and you'll get multiple sprouts from the ends of the branches, making it look kind of like a scraggly broomstick. And that is a direct result of too much salt in the soil.
Sweet gum is one of my favorite trees, Karen.
Is it really?
I like the leaves and those little spiky balls that it produces. The fruit are a great thing to throw at people. My brother, in a playful manner, obviously.
Oh, sure.
I remember my wife and I were we were out your way at Ogleby, and we were we were jogging or walking around, and this was obviously months ago, not right now. And I go, oh, look, it's sweet gum. That's my favorite tree. And she's like, how do you know it's sweet gum? And I picked up one of those little fruits with the spikes all over it, and I threw it at her. And I was like, see that? And she goes, oh, what'd you do that for? And I was like, well, you're always going to remember that sweet gum has these spiky balls on it.
Oh, my goodness gracious.
So it's just a good memory tool.
That, and it's got the 5 points on the leaves. The palmate leaf structure is also pretty unique. Looks like a little star almost.
Tangents are what we do in the show, right?
Right.
So let's get back to work. Okay. Let's talk about the different types of salts. I think we've been teasing people enough with that.
All right. So the most common de-icing products that are out there are calcium chloride, calcium magnesium acetate, magnesium chloride, potassium chloride, sodium chloride, and urea.
Yeah, the bottom two being the most popular, I think.
So, and a lot of it's going to depend probably when you're at the store, you're like, oh, well, this one's the cheapest. I'm going to get this one. But it may not be the one that's best for you. And so let's talk a little bit about the differences between them.
Probably the one that's been around the longest, good old sodium chloride, right? That we have identified as table salt.
Mm-hmm. Or rock salt.
Effective temperature down to 16 degrees Fahrenheit. Works quickly, can soften ice at lower temperatures than that, so it's not useless. Inexpensive, effective. However, it's corrosive, right? Or maybe corrosive is not the right word, but
it can be rough on any metal structures. So if you have a metal railing or something like that, it can cause damage to that as well. More so than, say, urea, which doesn't have any chloride ions, which cause that damage.
Yeah, so you'll start to see that rust happen, like probably at the attachment point of a metal railing,
right?
If you're overusing it, and then it breaks.
Yeah,
you got to get a new one.
Yeah, and I know that we said we're going to talk about the different ones, but I really want to jump on the overusing comment that you just made, because when you use too much of something, not only are you spending more money than you have to, but you're also increasing the potentiality of that chemical to run off into our waterways or to cause damage in your plants. So, 1 teaspoon of salt can pollute 5 gallons of water. And you think about the amount of de-icing chemicals that run off into our roadways, down our storm drains, and out into our creeks and streams, that really affects the oxygen levels in the water system and the ability of the water to mix, because you go down to Florida and you have brackish water where the salt water is coming in from the Gulf and the Atlantic Ocean, and then you have fresh water coming out from the lakes and streams, and they meet and they cause what's called brackish water. Now, our waters up here are all designed to be fresh. We do not have brackish water habitats in the mountains of Appalachia, right? So try not to create this type of habitat because it's not going to do well. It's going to affect our fish. It's going to affect our insects that make our fish happy. And of course, it's going to affect the plants as well.
Yeah. What is it that likes brackish water? Is it crab, shrimp?
There are a lot of brackish water creatures. There's a lot of mangroves in the brackish water. And so all of the plants and animals that go in the mangrove swamps, there's a lot. It's a very unique habitat, and I do not know enough about it to really speak on it. But maybe we can talk someone from Florida into coming onto our show and giving us that little talk.
No, it's fine. Yeah, again, let's us with the tangents. Okay, right. So we don't have that habitat. I guess we're not trying to create the habitat, but it is obviously too much of anything is going to be a bad thing. There's an LD level for anything.
Yes, including salt.
Guess what? Too much salt in your diet isn't good for you either. It's bad for your concrete and it's bad for your health. It can be. All right. Too much, right?
Right. So next one, right? We talked about sodium chloride. What's next?
So let's go into urea, the other popular variety here. Why don't you go ahead and tell us about urea, Karen?
Okay, so urea is going to be similar to sodium chloride, in fact, into its application temperature. So you're going to want to use urea as a de-icer as long as it's going to be about 15 degrees or higher. There is potential harm to vegetation, though. Even though urea is a fertilizer, we've talked before about how you can over-fertilize plants. And so you can have way too much of this nitrogen in your plants, and that can cause toxicity. But more often, you're going to get it to run off, and it's going to cause nitrogen pollution in our waterways. And that's where we'll get algal blooms and things like that. And so that is going to be rough. Plus, urea is going to be a lot more expensive than your sodium chloride, which is really going to impact your pocketbook if you are overusing it.
We were discussing this before the show. So sodium chloride effective at 16, according to the resource that we're using here. And urea, lowest practical temperature at 15. Right? So we were discussing that. And I don't know, Karen, do you want to kind of go into that a little bit?
Sure. So when we're talking about the practical temperature, it's not necessarily the effective temperature. So when we're talking about lowest practical temperature, it does work at a lower temperature, but it takes longer. And so the practical temperatures are designed to give you the desired effectiveness within 15 to 20 minutes of application. So when you're talking sodium chloride, it's effective to 16 degrees Fahrenheit. That doesn't mean that, so that means if it's less than 16 degrees, it's not doing anything. Right. Whereas your urea, its lowest practical temperature is 15 degrees Fahrenheit, but it will still be active at a lower temperature, just less active, and it's going to take longer for it to do the work. And so for practical temperatures, we're talking potassium chloride has a lowest practical temperature of 12. Magnesium chloride has a lowest practical temperature of 5. But when you get to, say, your calcium magnesium acetate, we know that it will work below 0. So if you're really chilly, that's a good one. But also calcium chloride is going to melt your ice down to -25. So if you are in an area that has seriously cold weather, leaning towards your calcium-based de-icers is going to be much more efficient and effective for you. So most of the Ohio Valley, we rarely are going to see single digits. Occasionally we get them, but they only last for a couple days. Those aren't the days to go out and try to use your de-icer if you're not using calcium chloride or calcium magnesium acetate. And those are going to be more expensive. Your calcium chloride, however, is not really going to harm your vegetation if you're using it as directed. Remember, these are chemicals. You have to read the label. The label is the law, and make sure that you're applying it properly. But it is more expensive than sodium chloride. And it is less likely also, if you have pets, it's less likely to hurt the pet's paws as opposed to sodium chloride. And if your pets like to lick the ground, also, again, the calcium chloride will be helpful in keeping them from getting a salt overdose.
Yeah, so that high blood pressure affects pets too.
It certainly does. And that's the thing, like the deer are so much more of a problem in the wintertime because they're coming out to the road to lick the salt off the road. And then they're just standing there looking at your car going, hey, this is my salt block, go away. And deer.
See? Yeah.
We're not getting on that tangent though.
No. Yeah, but I didn't think about salt block. Yeah.
That's right.
Okay. All right. So there are a lot of different things you can do to melt ice. So I guess one of the biggest hazards in the winter that we're kind of alluding to is slipping and falling, right?
Right.
So we did mention a few options that you have. Calcium chloride being the most effective at ridiculously low temperatures that we'll never see around here.
Right. -25, maybe up in Minnesota, but not here in the Ohio Valley.
Yeah.
At least I hope we're not going to see -25. I mean, if we're out in Montana, I'd be like, oh yeah, it's going to be -25 today. We're good, right?
Yeah, and it's more expensive than sodium chloride, but there's obviously a place for everything.
Right.
One of the things that we were doing before we started the show, we were looking at labels. And even though this one says the lowest practical temperature of 15, some of the labels will say 25 degrees because of that slower the slower activation of it. It just doesn't work as fast.
We talk about pesticide formulations and how they impact absorption. Well, the same goes for your salt formulations. And so if you're buying a salt formulation and it doesn't match the numbers we're giving you here today, that probably has a lot to do with something else that's in the package that's not just the base material.
Yeah, that's right. Like it'll like the different formulations some of them might be other active ingredients, some of them might be inert ingredients, but everything's going to have some kind of influence on how it works. So yeah, that bag label is really what's been tested. We're giving you some numbers that are researched, but that bag formulation, we don't know exactly what's in that bag. But the company that put it together does, and they've done tests with that product. When we say urea, there's so many different formulations of urea. There's really one chemical. It's a little complicated. There's a lot of inert ingredients in there, preservatives in there, and some of those can have an effect. Sometimes there's blends, and there's just a lot to keep track of. And when you're combining things, just like with pesticides, sometimes you get a different effect. You have to read the label before you use it, and you're going to see variations depending on the formulations that you're buying.
Right. And when you're looking at those formulations, you want to consider the full product that you're getting. How long is it going to act? And so, we talk about the sodium chloride's cheaper, but it doesn't act as long as, say, calcium chloride because of the chemical makeup of calcium chloride. It really wants to be in that liquid state. And as it comes in contact with water, it actually emits heat as part of its chemical reaction. Whereas your sodium chloride is going to absorb heat as part of its chemical reaction to go into that brine, which is going to go down and affect the connectivity of that ice to your sidewalk. So
Yeah, and that crystallization, it inhibits that crystallization that makes it real slippery.
Right. And so your calcium chloride might last longer as far as de-icing than your sodium chloride. And so that price variation is a little bit more difficult to interpret rather than the straightforward. So really look at that label and look at how long before reapplication is recommended. How much do you have to use? Do you have to use more of the one chemical versus the other chemical as far as how it's designed and built to go out on the shelf? So you have to consider more than just that base material, that base active ingredient.
Yeah, and price is one of those things where you got to make the best decision, best economical decision, right? We always talk about that in agriculture, but this is a similar idea. Is just because you can't use the best doesn't mean that other things won't work just fine.
Yeah, you definitely don't need to go out and get something that's going to work below 0 degrees if your temperatures never drop below 20. You know, you're going to have ice at 20, but you may not have to really deal with getting something that's going to be functional below 0 if that's not your normal temperature
Yeah, and
in the
it's
wintertime.
and one of the things that we were like talking about early on was just different plants that have different sensitivities to salts, right?
Hmm.
And the soil is really where it does the most damage. So, we do have a little chart here, and I just kind of want to talk about a couple things. It seems like maples are very sensitive to salt. So, as
Yes.
an example, you got a driveway. You got a maple tree right up against the driveway. Karen loves that. And then, if you are overusing your salt, well, let's say it's a steep driveway and the maple tree's at the bottom, right? And you're salting your driveway because you got to get out, you got to get to work, you don't want to slip. So as that brine, as the ice melts, and you get that brine water coming down, it's going to go down the slope at the base of the driveway, where it's not going to absorb in the concrete because concrete doesn't really absorb well, but it will flow into the soil and it'll start absorbing. So start thinking about that. Okay, well, how much do I like this tree? One, is it in a good place? Two, should I do something different? Is it going to kill my tree? Just understand that maples are going to be sensitive, and maybe if it's a tree you really like and you do notice that the runoff is going to go that direction, maybe urea is a better alternative, even though it might not work as fast depending on the temperature.
Right. That's exactly right. You need to consider the full impact of the chemical that you're applying. Do you live close to a stream? The greatest thing about the so-called tree lawn that I so despise for putting trees in because it's way too small, is that little grassy strip does help to keep the salt that you're putting on your sidewalk out of the storm drain system. So there is that little buffer strip, and that is what it should be used for, is to keep your lawn chemicals out of the watershed, right? And so that is a good thing that's there. So keep in mind, if you don't have that little grassy strip, that your application may be washing off into an area that has some sensitive plants. And, one of the worst things about losing the ash to the emerald ash borer was that ash was fairly tolerant of salt. And even if it was in the soil. And so it did okay with that. But unfortunately, we just don't have them anymore. Quaking aspen is one of those that you could use in an area where you may have some salt runoff from, say, a roadway or your driveway.
And it looks like many oaks are also tolerant. And again, we say tolerant, but not salt proof. Like you could still kill an oak with enough salt.
Oh, totally. Yeah. Yeah. And some of your oaks are going to be more tolerant than others. So, for instance, your white oak and your bur oak, which is a type of white oak, they're going to be more tolerant than, say, your scarlet oak, which is a type of red oak, which is actually fairly sensitive. So, just because it's an oak doesn't mean it's okay. Your red oaks are going to be much more sensitive than your white oaks.
And it looks like junipers are fairly tolerant. And one of the trees that's not on here that I just know from life, from learning things in life, is is the ginkgo. The living fossil.
No,
the
it
legend.
is on here.
Oh, it is on there. Does it
Yep.
have a big capital T next to it? I don't see it.
Absolutely not. It has a moderate tolerance to salt spray, but it has not been tested for soil-borne salt.
See, and I thought it was a popular tree in the city because it was so salt tolerant.
Well, so ginkgo is pollution tolerant. This is a prehistoric tree. So it was around when, carbon levels were so much higher. And so it's actually loving our climate change right now because it's getting back to the way it used to be when the ginkgo was formed, right? So it's used to high pollution in the air around it, and it's fine with it. So that's one of the reasons it is so overplanted in cities and communities, because it is resistant to so much. But it does only have a moderate resistance. So if it's on a roadway, and so
I mean, they're very popular on roadways.
Yeah. So one of the things you need to know is that any tree that maintains its leaves in the wintertime, your hollies, your spruces and pines, anything that has green on it in the wintertime, when de-icing salts are being used, those are going to be more sensitive because that salt lands right on the leaf, right next to those chlorophyll cells, and it's going to have an impact on those leaves, those living tissues that are active, and it's going to get sucked in through the pores on the leaf, and it's going to go right into those cells. So anything that has leaves in the wintertime, it will be more sensitive to salt spray. Now, if it has dropped its leaves, it's going to be less sensitive. Sometimes our trees are off schedule and they hold on to their leaves when we have, and this is especially in like February when the buds are starting to break and we get that late snow, or March, even April sometimes when we get that late freeze where it's just cold for an extended period and all of those fresh, sensitive buds are out. That's a really important time to grab some burlap and cover up any trees that are right up next to the roads so that they're not getting that salt spray on those fresh, sensitive baby leaves. So if you are out and your nursery stayed open through Christmas, but now they're shutting down and everything's on clearance, get some of that burlap and so that you have it whenever spring comes around and we want to protect our sensitive plants from that salt spray. That burlap can be really helpful in that. Thanks for listening to Extension Calling. This show is a collaboration between OSU Belmont County Extension Educator Dan Lima and WVU Ohio County Extension Agent Karen Cox. If you'd like a transcript of this show, contact us at the office. Also, let us know if you enjoy the show by ranking us on your podcast app.